Hi everybody, this is Agnes from Sediment, and today we are in Vila Nova de Gaia, a city where port wine is aged. Therefore, let's talk about its two most iconic styles, Tawny and Ruby Port. I will be releasing an ultimate guide to port wines a bit later. Therefore, today let's just focus on not so subtle differences between Tawny and Ruby ports. The reason I love Douro Valley so much, and hopefully I will be able to show you a little bit of it, is the dramatic views and steep, almost unworkable slopes where port wine begins. It is the largest mountainous vineyard area in the world, and in all honesty, I don't think anyone in their right mind would consider working this land a good idea, unless they knew what kind of potential and gems this land holds. What is interesting is that these two wine styles start their life very similarly. In my other videos where I compare and contrast different appellations or wine styles, we often talk about differences in winemaking areas, grape varieties, or blends. However, both of these wine styles are sourced from the very same area, which is Douro Valley. This valley is believed to be one of the very first, if not the first ever, demarcated wine region. It begins about 80 kilometers upstream of the Douro River from the city of Oporto and ends with the border of Spain. Though it has changed over time, it currently follows the schist soils for which this region is famous. Despite this region being relatively close to the Atlantic Ocean, it is actually protected by mountain ranges from its influence. While Porto is one of the wettest cities in Europe, the Douro region is sheltered from the Atlantic winds and rains, and it is relatively dry and experiences continental climate. As I indicated earlier, the grape varieties for both Tawny and Ruby ports are actually the same. While I have asked whether specific grape varieties are more linked with Tawny or Ruby styles, the answer I usually receive is no. And it makes sense, as this area is famous for having around 100 different local grape varieties, which usually are planted in what we call field blends. This means that single vineyard could contain many different grape varieties, and there is no separating them from each other. Sometimes even vineyard owners themselves, when asked what kind of grape varieties they are growing, will simply shrug their shoulders. The most praised and widely planted are Touriga Nacional, Tinto Sao, Touriga Franca, Tinta Roriz, Tinta Barroca, and Tinta Amarela. You will notice that I am excluding white grape varieties. That is because even though more and more exciting white ports are made, they do not fall under any of these categories, which is Ruby or Tawny. This is where things get interesting and differences begin. I will not go into detail about how port is made, and that will be reserved for the ultimate guide to port video. However, a short description is still necessary. The initial process of both styles still is relatively similar. We receive red grape varieties at the winery, the grapes are crushed, and fermentation can begin. It will last usually only a few days, not longer than 5, during which an extensive extraction will happen in order to extract as much color and tannin as possible. Fermentation is stopped by addition of spirit, which is why port is so sweet, as there is a lot of unfermented sugar still left. After fortification, these two port styles will walk very different paths. Ruby ports, named after their deep ruby color, are usually made with limited oxygen impact, thus retaining their fresh and rich fruit profile. These wines are usually aged for no longer than 3 years in large oak or stainless steel tanks and bottled relatively young. Tawny, on the other hand, is named after the tawny color these wines typically possess, ranging from garnet to brick orange and even pale amber. Unfortunately, some of the regular and cheaper tawnies will not gain their color because of the extended maturation, but will actually have additions of white grape varieties to reduce the intensity of color. And while tawny port is one of my favorite category, I would rarely choose regular tawny for simple enjoyment. The authentic Tawny port style should gain its nutty character and lose its color due to extended maturation in oak barrels, which can sometimes be for decades. The Tawny and Ruby ports come under various labels. The simplest and cheapest, but also least exciting, will be simply labeled as Tawny or Ruby. Ruby ports should be quite easy to enjoy, filled with rich and plump blue and black fruits, and as you might have guessed, they are deep ruby in color. Simple Tawny will show some dried fruit characters and nutty notes and will have tawny color. A slight upgrade in the category is the Reserve. They will still display Ruby or Tawny on their labels, but with the Reserve name attached. This usually means that the wine has been made from better quality fruit or has been aged a bit longer. It is also important to note that both of these categories will essentially be blended ports. Neither Simple Ruby, Tawny, nor Ruby or Tawny Reserve will have a vintage on their label. The next category, and definitely able to offer great bargain, is Late Bottle Vintage, or LBV. This is the one that we will also taste later. It is a single vintage port, and unlike the most famous Ruby port, the vintage port, it is aged in barrels for slightly longer, usually 4 to 6 years, compared to vintage, which is aged up to 2 years only. The majority of LBVs will be bottled filtered and is believed not to gain much from aging in the bottle, unlike vintage ports. Vintage ports already early in their life will throw a lot of sediment and are always advised to be decanted before serving. The epitome of Ruby port is vintage port. It is only made in exceptional years, bottled, unfiltered, and will live for decades in that bottle. It is one of the rare wines that I would suggest holding on to for years before opening, because it will only get better and definitely cannot deliver the same pleasure when young. There really should be a separate video dedicated only to vintage ports. But before we move on to the tasting, there are a few more Tawny port categories I want to discuss. One of the most exciting Tawny port categories for me is the Tawny with age indications. These are 10-year-old, 20, 30, 40, and even 50-year-old Tawny ports. These will not have a vintage on the label, but instead are made by blending several wines together in order to achieve a wine style that would represent the age on the label. Yes, apparently it does not represent the average age of the wine in the bottle. However, there's one Tawny category that has vintage on the label, and that is Quinta. These are usually aged for long periods in barrels and bottled only upon order. Naturally, only the best wines can stand that test of time, making them both expensive and really rare. But enough talking, let's do some tasting. So I have chosen here two wines. One of them is Quinta de la Rosa 20-year-old Tawny. So this is Tawny port with age indication, not average 20 years, but wine that will represent 20-year-old style. And we have Quinta de Noval, which is very loved and highly respected wine producer with its late bottle vintage. And if you remember, I told you that majority of late bottle vintage wines will be bottled filtered. This is unfiltered, so it is safe to say that it will have some sediment. And I would argue that this bottle as well, maybe not the small, but the largest, definitely the regular size for sure, will be able to live for years or maybe even decades in that bottle. So let's open up these wines and taste. Actually, the presence of the regular cork in this bottle of wine also serves as an indication that this wine can be laid down and aged. You will see that this specific bottle has a different type of cork, something that you do not pull out by going in. You just kind of do this. And it is not meant for aging. And this one we actually have to open up. You will notice that both of these wines are chilled, and I highly recommend and advise to chill your port wines. They don't have to be like fridge temperature, of course, naturally, but chilled, you know, down to 12 degrees If you like them warmer, maybe 15, no, down to 12 degrees. Okay, so I have poured myself 2 wines, and you immediately see the difference in the color. Now, only by looking at them, you will be able to say which one might be Tawny and which one will probably be late bottle vintage. Why I say might be Tawny is because if we are very, very lucky and that we get to taste wine that has been aged in a bottle for 100 years, that will be a vintage port, then it might have the same color. It might lose so much color during all that aging process. So we cannot assume straight away only from the color that this will be Tawny, you know, because ruby essentially with aging is becoming or getting closer to the Tawny style. So let's start with wine number 1, which is the Quinta de la Rosa 20-year-old Tawny. I wonder where people choose these small glasses, because I actually would like to pour this wine in a larger glass. But it is slightly floral and there is some dried cherry and prune notes. It may not display as much toastiness and nuttiness as I would expect from other Tawny ports. I would say that this style is quite unique, but it is very refreshing, and actually that toastiness, that coffee bean note, that chocolate bean is quite present on the palate. Of course it is sweet, but the one thing that I love about ports in general is that the best examples, they will start sweet and yet they will always finish quite dry. I wonder what makes this specific Quinta de la Rosa so unique, because it has a lot of red cherries. I usually tend to see a lot of blue and black berries in the ports. I mean, we are in the south, it can get very, very hot, so it only makes sense, you know, that these grapes reach full ripeness, and the grape varieties also tend to have more blue or black fruit flavors. But this specific one also displays some notes of dried strawberries and raspberries, and apparently they have vineyards planted in different terroirs, relatively close to the river and high up in the valley as well. Yeah, and this wine is relatively fresh and dried fruit driven. So let's move to wine number 2, which we see is much, much deeper in the color. And this is blue and black fruit immediately. Blueberries, blueberry crumble, and they're actually quite fresh. Similarly as with wine number 1, I would also love to see this wine in a bigger glass, because it just seems suffocating in there. It has so much more to offer, and yet I have poured this in this very small, tiny glass. But on the palate, it offers, I would say, there's a lot of freshness and quite enough body, firm, elevated tannin. Here in wine number 1, the tannin was almost non-existent. It was rather playful. And here for wine number 2, I still feel it sticking to my teeth, my gums, my cheeks. It is wine that requires time. And I mean, when I was studying about port wines, I always read that late bottle vintage should be enjoyed as young as possible. But tasting this wine, I think it would actually benefit from some age in the bottle. It is so nervy. It is still very, very, very fresh and kind of bright and sparky a bit. Like, it needs some time to calm down, I feel. So I would drink the Quinta de la Rosa 20-year-old Tawny tonight, and I would actually, despite what other books says, you know, and even I said in the beginning, I would be happy to open this wine maybe 5 years later, because I would guess that the tannins would calm down. It would still display a lot of fruit freshness and a lot of that power, but it would be a more rounded wine style. Thank you for watching, and if you like this video, you might want to tune in for the next.